Jon Snow stood on the ramparts of Winterfell beneath a sky as gray as slate, the breath of the north whispering ominous secrets in his ear. Everyone around him spoke of the threat beyond the wall, that ancient terror whose frosty presence was carried on the wind. He had stood face to face with the living dead, had felt cold dread coil in his chest, and had heard the soul-stripping shrieks of wights in the eerie darkness. Yet something in him had changed. Doubt and bitterness had crept into his heart after learning of his true parentage, after losing too many people he loved, after facing betrayal from his own men of the Night's Watch. He questioned whether his unification efforts or pleas to the Southern Lords would ever bear fruit. The War for the Dawn, a conflict meant to save them all, required too much faith, too many sacrifices, and demanded a unity he feared might never come to pass. He paced along the battlements, his black cloak flapping in the chill wind. The moonlight caught the faint lines of anxiety etched upon his face. Long, lonely nights had worn him down, and he was certain that the Seven Kingdoms would never wholly unite against the White Walkers in time. He was supposed to save the realm, so he had been told and so he had believed. But the realm did not seem interested in saving itself. Lords squabbled, queens bickered, and men plotted, all while a tide of death threatened to sweep over them. For so many years he had done his duty, as a bastard of Winterfell, as a brother of the Night's Watch, as its Lord Commander, and then as king in the North by acclamation. Duty, honor, sacrifice. Those had always been his guiding lights, but now they led only to a grim horizon, overshadowed by human greed and the petty ambitions that choked the Seven Unified Kingdoms. He could do everything right. He could lay the threat of the living dead bare before their very eyes, and still they would turn on him the moment it was politically expedient. His thoughts often circled back to Daenerys Targaryen, a woman of fire to his ice. She had the power of dragons at her disposal and an unwavering determination to claim her birthright. He believed that she might be the one ally he needed, but suspicion and tragedy loomed between them. The more he tried to unify the Seven Kingdoms in the face of impending doom, the more the realm fractured under the weight of old grudges. Alliances crumbled. In the end, every Southern Lord looked to protect his own piece of the board. Even Daenerys, for all her talk of breaking the wheel, sought that Iron Throne first and foremost, rarely allowing herself to consider that it might be meaningless if the cold armies of the dead poured across Westeros. He became convinced that calling upon them to help fight the White Walkers was doomed, for the war against them did not unite the realm. It simply brought out sharper divisions. Houses that had warred for centuries were not about to trust a Targaryen queen, nor a northern king who had once been a bastard, nor an unborn legend of ice and fire. On that stormy evening on the Winterfell ramparts, he made a decision that would change the fate of the world. Let the dead come if they must, he thought. The South, in all its arrogance and petty squabbles, deserved to tremble. If the living could not see reason, if they could not be persuaded to save themselves, perhaps they needed to face a different conqueror first, one that came from the north. It was a radical idea, one he had never entertained seriously before. But as the howling wind reminded him of all he had lost, as the weight of an ungrateful realm bore down on him, a determination, cold, potent, and fierce, sparked to life. Jon Snow would abandon the idea of saving everyone. Instead, he would conquer the disunited South, topple the Iron Throne, and raise a new dominion from the ashes, under his rule or under the banner of House Stark. Though he questioned if he were truly a Stark anymore, humanity would be forced to unite. And once the South was his, he would bend it to the cause of the North, forging an unbreakable front against the White Walkers when the time came. He kept this decision close to his chest. Not even Sansa, with her sharp mind and her knowledge of intrigue, would hear of this plan until the right moment. Not even Davos Seaworth, ever faithful and always wise. Not even Tormund Giantsbane, his staunch ally, would suspect that Jon no longer intended to rally them in a desperate northern defense. Instead, Jon began to train an army of fearsome northerners, wildlings, and loyal vassals, forging them into a lean, unyielding force. He left the White Walkers behind the wall, trusting that the immense structure, still guarded by the Night's Watch in part, could hold them for at least long enough to see his new plan take shape. Rumors passed through Winterfell like restless ghosts. The men whispered that Jon Snow had changed. The old gloom in him had hardened into something more distant, more calculating. He trained with the spearwives of the free folk, with the archers of the northern houses, with the halberdiers from the Wolfswood. He created new drilling programs led by experienced men like Roderick Forrester and Lyanna Mormont's loyal guard, forging an elite cadre. As winter deepened, provisions grew scarce, but he consolidated all resources, demanding loyalty from the north. The men obeyed, for he was still Ned Stark's son in their eyes, no matter how the whispers of Targaryen blood hovered at the edges. In the great hall of Winterfell, the lords and ladies dined amid the flickering torches. Tension lingered at every feast. Jon no longer pleaded with them to unite for a war in the far north that they barely believed in. Instead, he demanded their fealty in a straightforward manner. He spoke of the betrayals of the South, the historical injustices done to the North. He invoked the memory of Torrhen Stark, the king who knelt, who surrendered to Aegon Targaryen long ago. He argued that the North had a claim upon the entire continent, that they had long been the underappreciated guardians of the realm, the watchers on the walls. For centuries, they had stood between the living and the dead while the southern lords drank their wine and feasted. No more, he said. If the southern throne would not help defend the living, the north would march south and seize power for itself. At first, some lords trembled at such open talk of conquest. But as the wind whistled outside, and as word reached them of the continuing chaos in King's Landing, Cersei Lannister still sat on the Iron Throne, stubborn and cunning, while Daenerys Targaryen fumed in Dragonstone, biding her time. The northern lords grew bolder. If they did not unify, if they did not seize this moment, more chaos would follow. The North had never truly been a priority for the Iron Throne. It was time for the North to prioritize itself. Quietly, even before announcing an open campaign, Jon had already brokered deals with certain disillusioned southern houses. Ravens had flown in secret to Dorne, to the Stormlands, and to the Riverlands. Anywhere that yearned for a leader who might finally bring some semblance of peace and justice. He offered them a share in a grand new realm if they bent the knee to the king in the north, forging alliances that only he knew about. His parentage as a Targaryen bastard might have complicated matters, but he used it to his advantage as well. He was a Stark, yes, but also had the blood of old Valyria in his veins. He was no ordinary pretender. Meanwhile, Sansa watched from the corner of the hall, her bright auburn hair contrasting with the cold stone walls. She studied her half-brother cousin in truth and noticed the changes in him. She suspected he had a plan hidden behind the stern set of his jaw. Yet he offered her only the vaguest details. The two no longer spoke freely, for suspicion had crept between them. Each recognized the other's skill. Sansa in the politics of the realm, Jon in command and warfare. And each worried that the other's ambition might lead the North astray. But Jon knew he needed her. He needed a mind that could outmaneuver southern lords. He needed a presence that could keep Winterfell running while he marched with armies. So he kept her close, shared a portion of his thoughts, and entrusted her to manage the North's day-to-day governance. Sansa's pride was wounded by Jon's secrecy, but she accepted her role. The Stark name was strong, and she believed that eventually, once Jon found a way to end all these wars, he would come back to reason. Outside the castle, the roads froze and white winds howled. Winter was at its peak. Snowdrifts piled high, making travel nearly impossible for armies. Yet, in this harshest season, Jon Snow found a grim advantage. The South was less accustomed to such brutal conditions. If he marched now, if he used the savage cold to his benefit, he could catch southern armies unprepared. So, while the snow continued to fall, he began to move his forces slowly down the King's Road, a silent wave of fur-clad soldiers, wool-wrapped horses, and wagons heavy with supplies. He traveled first to Moat Cailin, that ancient fortress that guarded the southern approaches to the north. He reinforced it with an additional garrison, ensuring that if any southern force dared to come north uninvited, they would face a stony wall of northern steel. There, he gathered the bannermen and addressed them in a makeshift war council. Lords Serwyn, Manderley, Glover, and many others listened as Jon laid out the first steps of his campaign. The North would move as a disciplined host. Smaller vanguards would break off to subdue holdfasts in the Riverlands, forging alliances or compelling submission. They would secure the neck, ensuring that no southern relief army could easily strike at their rear. It was a massive undertaking. The North had not attempted a conquest of this scale since the days of the kings in the North, centuries past. Many were nervous, but they saw the determination in Jon's eyes, and they remembered how he had returned from death itself. They remembered how he had united wildlings and Northmen, how he had ridden the windswept fields of the Battle of the Bastards, sword raised against Ramsay Bolton. Whatever doubts lingered, they found themselves swept away by the memory that this man, this half-Stark, half-Targaryen, had performed miracles before. As the armies began their slow advance, ravens carried tidings southward of a massive northern host on the march. The lords of the Riverlands braced themselves, uncertain whether to view Jon as a hero or a new conqueror. The common folk whispered of the king in the north riding at the head of a great column, ghosts of ancient Stark kings at his side. Some stories claimed he had tamed dire wolves the size of horses, that the very snowstorms accompanied him as if he commanded winter itself. In King's Landing, Cersei Lannister grew anxious. If the North marched south, then indeed war was coming. She consulted her hand, Qyburn, and commanded her armies to fortify the Crownlands. At the same time, she reached out to Euron Greyjoy, seeking his Iron Fleet to protect her coasts. Daenerys Targaryen, camped at Dragonstone, felt a mixture of confusion and rage. Jon Snow had promised to join her in fighting the army of the dead, yet news reached her that the king in the north was assembling an army to move south. Had he truly abandoned the fight against the White Walkers, or was this some cunning ploy? Tyrion Lannister, her hand, urged caution. If Jon Snow had turned his ambitions to conquest, it might be because he believed the Iron Throne was the key to forging a united front. An explanation that Tyrion tentatively proposed, though he was unsure. Daenerys, always impatient, considered flying her dragons to meet him in the field, to force a parley or a confrontation. But winter storms made flights risky, and she had lost one dragon already beyond the wall. She could ill afford to lose another. For weeks, Jon's army slogged south through the snowbound terrain. As they passed abandoned villages and ransacked holdfasts, remnants of the War of the Five Kings, his officers recruited any stray sellswords or willing men who sought plunder or stable employment. Among them were some who had fled the ravages of the Riverlands, peasants whose homes had been burned. Jon's men offered them a choice: join the northern host or face the winter alone. Many chose to join, and so the northern army grew in size and diversity. As they neared the twins' seat of House Frey, they found the place in disarray after Arya Stark's infamous vengeance. Walder Frey and many of his progeny were dead, and the lesser Freys scrabbled for power. Upon hearing of the northern host's approach, some of these Freys declared loyalty to the king in the north immediately, hoping to retain their lands. Others barricaded themselves inside the fortress. Jon dispatched a portion of his army under the command of Lord Wyman Manderley to subdue any resistance. The siege was brief and brutal. Starving, uncertain of the future, and lacking strong leadership, the Freys soon surrendered. Jon did not bother with showy acts of mercy or cruelty. He simply demanded they yield their castle, deliver their arms, and swear fealty. The twins, a crucial crossing, was now under northern control, an ominous sign for the rest of the realm. Victory at the twins emboldened the army and swelled its ranks. Riverlords who had despised the Freys now saw an opportunity to strike against the Lannisters who had once allied with them. They hesitated only because the name Targaryen lingered in the air like a taboo, but if this rumored Targaryen parentage made Jon Snow a threat to the Iron Throne, that suited many who harbored resentment against King's Landing. And so small numbers of crossbowmen, knights, and common folk continued to join. Jon welcomed them, providing rations and promising a share of any southern spoils. At Harrenhal, that immense ruin haunted by the ghosts of Aegon's conquest, Jon paused. Once more, he gathered his commanders in the old Great Hall, blackened pillars still smelling faintly of soot even after all these years. Ghost, his albino direwolf, prowled among the shadows, silent as ever. Tormund Giant's Bane, with his fiery red hair and booming laugh, told stories of how he had never imagined fighting this far south. Davos Seaworth, quiet but vigilant, spoke of caution. He urged Jon to seek alliances with the Vale or the Stormlands rather than simply smash everything in sight. Lord Royce of the Vale, who had not yet declared either way, was rumored to be gathering knights near the Bloody Gate. Jon listened. He weighed the counsel of his bannermen, but each day he felt the weight of the next steps. The White Walkers were not defeated, far from it. They still loomed beyond the wall, and if his conquest were to matter, it needed to be swift. He needed to take King's Landing, to seat himself in the Red Keep, and to command the realm's full resources to stand against the undead. Then, and only then, would he march north again. So his strategy evolved. He dispatched envoys to the Vale, seeking to sway them. He also sent a coded message to Dorne, where House Martell's remnants quietly smoldered after their losses in the war. He proposed an alliance. The North would grant Dorne broader autonomy if they recognized Jon's kingship over the realm. Some in Dorne grumbled. What difference was a northern king to them? But the thirst for Lannister blood ran deep, and many recognized that a new order might give them a chance to recover lost ground, perhaps even avenge Elia Martell's memory. The real question was what Daenerys would do. Despite the winter storms, she had begun to move her forces from Dragonstone to the mainland. Her unsullied, still formidable, marched under the banner of the three-headed dragon. A handful of Dothraki, their numbers diminished after the battles against the Lannisters, rode with her. And of course, she had 2 living dragons, though they were subdued by the cold. Tyrion Lannister, Grey Worm, and Missandei accompanied her, though tensions ran high in her camp. Jon learned through his ravens that Daenerys was encamped near Rosby, north of King's Landing. It was said that she considered an alliance with him, or a confrontation. If Daenerys pledged her dragons to his cause, they might take the Iron Throne in a matter of weeks. Yet, Jon no longer trusted that she would do so willingly, not after so many misunderstandings and the knowledge of his claim outranking hers. He sensed that a clash between them might be inevitable. When his scouts reported the Unsullied's presence just a few leagues away, he called a halt to his main force and set up an encampment on a broad plain, the snow lightly covering the tall grasses. Torches dotted the northern camp, and warhorses stomped in the frosty soil. The gloom of the winter sky settled over them, early night falling. Jon rode out with a small escort to meet Daenerys' envoys, who approached under a white banner of truce. There, on a small rise overlooking the plain, Jon saw Tyrion Lannister once again. The dwarf wore a heavy cloak trimmed with fur, the only concession to the biting cold. Behind him stood Grey Worm, face impassive, and Missandei, her features grave. Jon dismounted, stepping forward. Ghost padded by his side, ears perked. "Jon," Tyrion greeted him, a wary warmth in his eyes. "I don't suppose you expected we'd meet again like this." Jon said nothing at first, studying Tyrion's expression. At length, he spoke in a quiet voice, tinged with an undercurrent of hard resolution. "I thought we were allies once. It seems times have changed." Tyrion sighed. "The Queen wishes to speak with you in person, privately if possible. We are uncertain of your intentions, Jon." "And I of hers," Jon admitted. Grey Worm's hands tightened on his spear, though no threat was spoken. Missandei stepped forward, her voice calm. "Daenerys of the House Targaryen asks only for a chance to understand why you march on the Iron Throne when the dead still threaten from the north." A flicker of old guilt crossed Jon's gaze, but he concealed it swiftly. "My reasons are my own," he said. "If she wants to help me, tell her to bring her dragons and lay siege to King's Landing. Enough words. It's time for action." Tyrion studied Jon carefully. "Action without a plan is chaos, Jon. Don't let bitterness guide your decisions. Whatever has happened, we both want to save Westeros, don't we?" Jon set his jaw. He felt a surge of anger, an emotion that had grown familiar these last months. When I tried to warn the realm about the White Walkers, no one listened. Daenerys wanted the Iron Throne. Cersei hoarded power. The lords of the realm squabbled over trifles. Let the White Walkers come if they must. I don't care anymore. Only one thing will unite these kingdoms, and it's not words. It's conquest. So either Daenerys stands aside or she helps me. If she stands in my way, I'll treat her as I treat any other opponent. Tyrion exhaled, his breath a white cloud in the cold air. Missandei looked troubled, and Grey Worm's stoicism faltered for a heartbeat. After a heavy pause, Tyrion spoke softly. I will deliver your words to her. Know that she still has some fondness for you, even if this path of yours baffles and angers her. If war must come between you, it will be a tragedy. Jon inclined his head slightly, then watched as Tyrion and the others rode away. He returned to his camp, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and fierce resolve. He did not relish the thought of fighting Daenerys. Gods knew the devastation dragons could bring. But if that was what it took to seize E7 kingdoms and forge a realm strong enough to face the darkness in the north, so be it. Within a day, Daenerys Targaryen herself came forth. She approached under the white banner riding a pale horse. At her side was a small contingent of Unsullied, but she left her dragons behind, presumably to keep them from being perceived as a direct threat. Jon met her with Ghost and a small party of Northern Knights. The two parted from their escorts and spoke alone, just out of earshot but within view. They stood among the snow-laced grass, the wind whipping around them. Jon wore dark leathers and fur, his sword Longclaw sheathed at his hip. Daenerys wore a thick coat of white fur, silver filigree weaving across her shoulders, and her platinum hair was braided against the chill. They regarded each other in silence for a long moment, recalling the bond they once shared, now overshadowed by confusion and mistrust. She broke the silence first. You swore to me, Jon. You swore we would fight the army of the dead together. Why have you turned south? He tried to keep his voice steady, though a flicker of regret tugged at his chest. I did swear, and for a time I believed we could unite everyone. But all of us, Cersei, you, the Northern Lords, the Riverlands, could not see past our own ambitions and suspicions. The time for words ended. If we keep waiting for the realm to unite, the dead will overrun us before we can mount a real defense. But you're not heading north, she said, anger lacing her voice. You're marching on King's Landing. That's no defense, it's an invasion. You say you want to save the realm from the White Walkers, but you're turning swords on your own people. Jon felt the harsh winter wind bite into his cheeks. They're not my people. Not yet. But if I conquer them, they will be. Then no one will question the call to fight the White Walkers. No one will bicker or betray or hesitate. Under a single banner, under my command, they'll have no choice but to face the threat that's coming. Daenerys's gaze flickered with equal measures of fury and sorrow. Conquest by fire and steel. Do you truly think that will unite a bitter, war-weary land? He took a step closer, dropping his voice. I don't know, but I know words have failed. I tried forging alliances, but the moment it was inconvenient, those alliances fell apart. I've lost too many to keep trusting in diplomacy alone. I am done kneeling. If that makes me a conqueror, so be it. She studied him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of the man she once knew. You have Targaryen blood, she said, her voice trembling with complex emotions. You might be the rightful heir to the Iron Throne. Join me instead. Together, our forces could take King's Landing without destroying half the city. We can rule as king and queen, and then march north together. End this madness. Jon lowered his eyes. The offer tempted him for a moment with visions of a united front. But he remembered the cynicism he had faced, the betrayals, the endless complications of bending the knee to someone else's cause. He shook his head. I can't do that. Too many in the north distrust the Targaryen name. Too many see dragons as a threat. They'll never fully accept you, Daenerys, not even if I vouch for you. The North trusts me because I carry the Stark name in spirit, if not in blood. If we are to unite them, I must stand at the top." "Then you mean to fight me for it?" she said, voice trembling with anger. "If you stand in my way," Jon replied quietly. Their gazes locked in a tortured moment of mutual sorrow. Here stood two leaders who had once believed in each other, now shaped by war and betrayal into would-be conquerors of the same kingdom. A swirl of snow blew between them, marking the vast distance that had grown. She opened her mouth as if to say more, but a raging tempest of emotion stole her words. She simply turned, mounted her horse, and rode back to her camp without another word. Jon watched her go, his heart pounding with an ache that no victory could ease. Over the next days, tensions soared. The northern host advanced slowly, and Daenerys' forces shadowed them, always just out of reach. Occasional skirmishes erupted between outriders, though each side held back from a full-scale battle. Cersei, from within the Red Keep, sent frantic orders to gather her armies close to the city and to prepare wildfire stockpiles. Chaos reigned across the Crownlands, villages emptying as peasants fled either south to the sea or west toward the Lannister-held territories. At last, the northern host drew near to King's Landing. The city rose before them, battered walls from previous sieges still bearing scars. The blackened dome of the Great September of Baelor in ruins since Cersei's last act of destruction. Smoke curled from countless chimneys, and the smell of ash and unwashed masses carried on the cold wind. Jon positioned his army across the northern roads that led into the city, constructing siege engines from the lumber they'd hauled south or found in the surrounding countryside. Daenerys and her forces took up a position to the southeast, near the Rose Road, effectively surrounding King's Landing on multiple fronts, though she had not yet declared open alliance or war with Jon. The uneasy standoff persisted. Everyone waited to see who would strike first. Jon knew the time for half measures was gone. His scouts reported that Euron Greyjoy's fleet patrolled Blackwater Bay, fortifying the city's seaward flank. To storm King's Landing by land alone was possible, but it would be costly, and thousands of innocents would likely die in the crossfire. It reminded him of the bloodshed he'd witnessed at Hardhome, where the dead had swarmed the living. He shivered at the memory. War was war, though. If the city resisted, if the Lannister loyalists refused to open the gates, he would do what he must. Cersei refused parley. Her archers lined the ramparts, and caches of wildfire awaited any assault. The notion of unleashing wildfire in a city of 1 million souls was unthinkable, but Cersei had proven her capacity for madness. Jon realized he could not let her retain power. He had to force her from the throne before she destroyed the realm. On the second night outside the walls, the clouds churned a sullen gray, and a bone-chilling wind swept across the fields. Jon's men huddled around campfires, bundled in furs, telling stories of old battles to keep morale from faltering. In his command tent, Jon met with his advisors, Tormund, Davos, Lord Manderly, a few seasoned knights from the Riverlands, and a scrawny youth from House Reed who had proven adept at scouting. They pored over crude maps of the city's defenses. "We can't simply starve them out," Davos said quietly, stroking his beard. "We don't have the luxury of time. Cersei will never surrender, and every day we linger, the White Walkers may be approaching the wall." Tormund scowled. "Then let's climb over their walls and kill every lion in sight." Lord Manderly shook his head. "That's a great way to get thousands of our men burned by wildfire. We need a more measured approach." Jon listened, silent at first. "We might not need to assault the walls if we can open the gates from within," he said finally. "Our scouts have reported many in the city are starving. They resent Cersei. If we slip a small force inside, we might rally an uprising, or bribe the gold cloaks to open the gates." "It's a risk," Davos said, "but a risk that might save many lives if it works. I've smuggled into King's Landing before, granted that was by sea, but there might be other ways." So they plotted, forging a plan to infiltrate the city and incite a revolt against the Queen. Meanwhile, the main northern host would be prepared to storm the gates the moment they opened. It was a delicate plan, hinging on timing and trust in unreliable city folk. But none of them fancied a direct siege under threat of wildfire. They moved swiftly. Davos and a handful of men donned old cloaks, battered armor and tattered rags, slipping toward the city gates in the dead of night. They carried hidden pouches of gold and silver, gleaned from the spoils at the Twins and Harrenhal. Through cunning, bribes, and knowledge of the city's lesser-known passages, they aimed to reach disaffected gold cloaks or even hungry citizens who might be swayed by coin and promises of bread. While they waited, the tension around the city ramped up. Daenerys shifted her forces slightly, and at dawn, her dragons soared overhead once, their silhouettes cutting through the icy sky. It was a display meant to remind both Cersei and Jon of her power. Across the battlefield, soldiers gawked or shielded their eyes as the winged beasts roared. Jon stood resolute, refusing to react overtly, but inside he felt a pang of worry. If Daenerys decided to unleash dragonfire on King's Landing, thousands would die, and his entire plan of a relatively bloodless coup would collapse. Days passed in stalemate. Snow flurries dusted the tents, turning the once muddy fields into a frozen wasteland. Davos's infiltration team lay low within the city, seeding rumors that the king in the north had come to free them from Lannister tyranny. Some of the gold cloaks, weary of Cersei's demands and fearful of her rumored madness, began to waver. A clandestine arrangement was made. On the fifth night, certain gold cloaks stationed at the Gate of the Gods would turn a blind eye if a small band of northern men approached. And so on the designated night, under cover of the moonless sky, Jon led a strike force of 100 chosen warriors to the gate. They wore dark cloaks, moving in silence. Ghost padded beside Jon, sniffing the cold air. Tormund was at Jon's side, too large to blend in seamlessly, but determined to be there for this crucial moment. They crept to the gate, hearts pounding. The city walls towered above them, torches flickering in the embrasures. A pair of gold cloaks stood on the parapet, exchanging murmurs. One quietly signaled them. The heavy gate was unbarred from within, inch by inch, just enough for Jon's men to slip inside. Every moment they expected a shout of alarm. But the infiltration continued. More gold cloaks, apparently in on the plan, kept watch, ensuring no others discovered the open gate. Once inside, Jon's men fanned out through the streets, guided by Davos's knowledge. They moved swiftly, seizing key intersections, urging frightened citizens to remain indoors. A hush fell across the night as word spread that northern soldiers were in the city. Tensions were high, but no full alarm was raised. Some pockets of Lannister loyalists, suspecting a breach, roused themselves, leading to a few skirmishes. Steel clashed in the winding alleys. Shouts rang out, but the city, half-starved and deeply divided, did not unite against the invaders. Jon's main concern was to prevent a slaughter. He issued strict orders. Kill only those who resist. Do not harm peasants or any who surrender. This was meant to be a liberation, not a sack. But controlling a city the size of King's Landing was no small feat. Chaos threatened to erupt at every corner, as criminals took advantage of the confusion to loot shops and homes. Northern soldiers tried to keep order, but amidst the labyrinth of streets, mayhem flared. Eventually, the word reached the Red Keep. Cersei was roused from her chamber. Ser Gregor Clegane, the monstrous bodyguard known as the Mountain, stood guard at her side. She summoned the last loyal men of the City Watch to defend the keep. Qyburn hurried through the corridors, giving frantic orders to prepare the caches of wildfire. If the city was lost, Cersei would burn it rather than hand it over. Jon knew they had limited time before the Queen unleashed her final weapon. With Tormund and a growing band of northern warriors, he raced toward the Red Keep, weaving through half-deserted streets. The gold cloaks who had sided with him guided them to lesser-known gates and access points, avoiding choke points where Cersei's loyalists might have formed defenses. They arrived at the massive gatehouse of the Red Keep just before dawn, its red walls seeming dark and foreboding in the dim, cold light. Archers loyal to Cersei fired from the battlements, arrows whistling past. Jon's men raised shields, returning fire with northern longbows. Under cover of these arrows, a small group rushed the gate wielding battering rams. Slowly, they began to break through. The thunderous booms echoed through the courtyard. From high above, Daenerys's dragons roared. The pounding of wings echoed. Jon looked up, fear and hope warring in his chest. Would she use her dragons to scorch the keep, or would she allow him his victory? A sudden rush of heat flared across the battlements. Drogon, the larger dragon, unleashed a torrent of flames upon the ramparts where Lannister archers stood. Jon saw men plunge from the walls, screaming as they fell. The dragon's roar shook the foundations of the fortress. More northern soldiers poured into the courtyard, taking advantage of the chaos. Jon realized Daenerys had chosen to assist him, or at least chosen to attack Cersei, rather than let him claim the city alone. With the gate battered open, Jon and his men surged through. Inside the keep's walls, frantic Lannister guards resisted. Tormund led the charge, cleaving through the defenders. Jon advanced toward the throne room, stepping over broken masonry and scattered bodies. Fires blazed in parts of the keep where the dragonfire had caught. Smoke thickened the air. Cersei, from her vantage within the keep, saw that all was lost. She clutched her pregnant belly, whether truth or rumor, none knew for certain, and demanded Qyburn set off the wildfire. He pleaded with her, warning that there was no telling what the chain reaction might do. The entire city could be destroyed, but her eyes were filled with vengeful delirium. If she could not have the throne, no one would. As Qyburn tried to reach for the hidden lever, the doors burst open. Jon, Tormund, Davos, and a handful of men spilled in. The mountain stood, sword in hand, blocking the path to the queen. Jon stared at the hulking man, feeling a shiver of fear. Tormund bellowed and charged, only to be hurled aside by a backhanded blow from the undead knight. Jon lunged in, Longclaw singing through the air. The mountain swung his massive blade, and steel met Valyrian steel in a jarring collision. Jon ducked, dancing aside as the mountain's sword crashed into the floor. Sparks flew. Jon feinted left, then slashed the abomination's side. The sword bit flesh, but it was as if the giant knight felt no pain. He turned, nearly catching Jon in a crushing grip. From behind, Davos mustered courage and thrust a spear at the mountain's back, but it barely penetrated. The undead knight backhanded him, sending him crashing into a pillar. Jon pressed the advantage, slashing again at the mountain's head or neck, seeking a vulnerable gap. The monstrous guard roared, swinging his blade in a deadly arc. Jon rolled beneath it, and as the knight turned again, Tormund, recovering from the earlier blow, slammed a heavy axe into the back of the mountain's knee. With a roar, the giant warrior staggered, dropping to one knee. Jon sprang up, driving Longclaw through the visor of the knight's helm. The Valyrian steel pierced the decaying flesh beneath. For a moment, the mountain's arms flailed. Then the hulking corpse collapsed with a thud, black ichor oozing from the wound. Cersei, seeing her monstrous champion fall, tried to run toward the wildfire lever, but Jon was on her in an instant, grabbing her wrist and wrenching it away. She screamed in fury, lashing out with her nails, but he held her fast. She spat in his face, calling him a traitor, a northern savage, an up-jumped bastard. Jon stared at her, breath ragged, smoke stinging his eyes. Part of him wanted to end it here, to put an end to her cruelty once and for all. But he remembered what Ned Stark would have done. He believed in justice, not murder. He rested her arms behind her, calling for guards to restrain her. Shouts echoed in the corridors as more northern men flooded in. Daenerys Targaryen arrived at that moment, flanked by Grey Worm and a handful of Unsullied. She looked upon Cersei, her old rival, now a captive at last. For a tense moment, Daenerys and Jon locked gazes. The city was effectively theirs. Smoke rose around them, the Red Keep partly aflame. Outside, bells began to ring. Whether for surrender or alarm, no one knew. The realm had seen many claimants to the Iron Throne, but none like these two. Cersei screamed curses at Daenerys, at Jon, at all who had betrayed her. Daenerys advanced, eyes full of cold wrath. "She would have burned this city again," Daenerys said. "She deserves to die." Jon nodded slowly. "She nearly did if we hadn't stopped her." Davos, battered and limping, interjected. We need to secure the wildfire caches before they explode, Your Grace. Jon motioned for men to follow Qyburn, who cowered by the wall, to ensure no final sabotage took place. Then his gaze settled on Cersei once more. She'll face justice for her crimes. We'll see she doesn't escape. Daenerys studied him, her expression unreadable. And who will wear the crown now that the Lannisters have fallen? A hush fell over the chamber. Tormund and Davos glanced at Jon, while Grey Worm stood near Daenerys, stance wary. This was the moment that had been building from the moment Jon turned south. Jon lifted his head, setting his jaw. I came south for the throne, for the power to unite this realm against the threat beyond the wall. Cersei is done, her reign is over. I intend to claim it. Daenerys' eyes flashed. I was born to reclaim the Iron Throne. My father ruled this city, and my ancestors built it. My blood is Targaryen. And so is mine, Jon said quietly, cutting her off. She paused, her fury warring with the memories of their once shared cause. Do you truly believe the realm will accept you as king? Jon looked at Cersei, trembling with rage and fear in the Unsullied's grip. He looked at the destruction around him, the fires devouring the keep, the corpses of men who had fallen in battle. The cost of conquest was steep, and more battles waited on the horizon. Yet he could not deny the sense of finality. They must accept me, he said, or there will be more war. But I won't force them to kneel in blood if they don't resist. Daenerys' breath trembled in her chest. Then you'd have me bend the knee to you, after all I have done to reach this moment? Jon's lips thinned. I'd rather you stand beside me, Daenerys, but we can't share the throne. I won't risk the realm's unity by splitting leadership again. Look at all that's happened with multiple claimants. She held his gaze, heartbreak twisting her features. Around them, the chaos of victory continued. The city had surrendered, gold cloaks were laying down arms or switching sides, while the populace hunkered in fear in their homes. The Red Keep shook as small fires were put out by rushing soldiers. Grey Worm tightened his grip on his spear, waiting for Daenerys' order. Tormund, Davos, and the others braced themselves, uncertain whether violence between these two conquerors would erupt. In that high and lonely place, Daenerys recalled the prophecies that had driven her. She remembered the feeling of her dragons hatching in the funeral pyre of Khal Drogo, remembered how she had freed slaves in Essos. She had seen herself as a liberator, but now, she stood in the ashes of a city that was once her father's seat, facing a man who carried the same blood but had a powerful claim of high throne. The pain in her eyes spoke of betrayal and disappointment. Yet, she recognized that the armies of Westeros stood behind Jon Snow. She had her dragons, yes, but the realm had given its love, such as it was, to a man they saw as a Stark returned from the dead, a hero of the people. At length, she spoke, her voice quavering with unshed tears. If the realm must have a single ruler to face the dead, then let it be you, Jon Snow. Her eyes flashed with final defiance. But know that I will not fade away. If you fail this realm, I will take back what was once mine. Jon bowed his head, relief and sadness flooding through him. I only hope I prove worthy, he murmured. She gestured curtly, and Grey Worm released Cersei into the custody of Jon's men. Then Daenerys turned, her silver-white hair trailing behind her, and walked from the throne room. Jon watched her go, an ache in his chest he could not name. He did not celebrate this victory. The throne room felt hollow, its vaulted ceiling echoing with the crackle of distant fires. As dawn broke, word spread through King's Landing that the war was over. Jon Snow claimed the Iron Throne, and Daenerys Targaryen did not contest him. There was no grand coronation yet, only the image of a grim, black-clad warrior ascending the charred steps to sit upon that jagged seat of iron and steel. Soldiers of the north guarded him, while the populace dared to creep out of their hovels and gather in the streets, unsure whether to kneel or curse. The city was battered, the Red Keep smoldering. Cersei and her remaining loyalists had been defeated, though pockets of Lannister resistance might still lurk. The realm at large would take time to learn of this new king in the north who now sat the Iron Throne. Jon summoned the city's few highborn survivors, gold cloak captains, and representatives of the populace to the throne room. Davos and Tormund stood at his side, along with several northern and river lords. The hush was palpable. Jon, though never craving to be a king, found himself locked in this role now out of necessity. His voice rang out, echoing in the still air. "I have come to claim this city not as a tyrant, but as a liberator," he said, repeating a line reminiscent of Daenerys' older ideals. "Cersei Lannister has been deposed. The war for the throne is over. I am Jon Snow, born of House Targaryen and House Stark, and I am king of the Seven Kingdoms. I intend to unite this realm, not fracture it further." Murmurs passed through those assembled. Some looked upon him in awe, others in fear. After all, this was the first time many had seen him. He knew their acceptance was tenuous. He continued, his voice resolute. "Winter is upon us. The true threat comes from beyond the wall. I will not force my new subjects to die in the south. If you keep the peace and swear loyalty, you shall be free to tend your homes and families. We must all rally against the coming storm. We will rebuild this city together, so that it may stand strong when the dead march." His words were met with uncertain cheers and scattered applause. The city's inhabitants had witnessed so many rulers come and go, so many false dawns. They were wary, yet the relief that Cersei's rule of terror was over sparked a cautious optimism. Food stores would be made available. Jon promised to bring supplies from the Reach, forging alliances with those who had yet to submit. Amid the confusion and relief, Daenerys walked among the commoners, her unsullied at her back. She had not bowed to Jon, and some wondered if she would attempt a coup soon. But for the moment, she seemed content to see Cersei unseated. She spoke quietly with those she passed, promising them that their new king would remember them. Jon, upon dismounting the throne and stepping aside from the public eye, found himself exhausted beyond measure. The trial of Cersei loomed. The question of what to do with Jaime Lannister, who was nowhere to be found, remained. The entire realm would need to be brought to heel, and that was only the beginning. Soon he would have to ride north to meet the real war. The White Walkers could not be held back forever. Over the following weeks, the city settled under the presence of northern troops. Cersei was imprisoned in a secure tower, awaiting trial for her crimes. Qyburn was thrown into a cell as well, his dark experiments confiscated. The various lords of the Crownlands came forth, grudgingly swearing loyalty to the new king. Ravens flew to all corners of Westeros announcing that Jon Snow now sat the Iron Throne, calling on each lord to swear fealty or face the consequences. Those loyal to the Lannisters, scattered across the west, braced themselves. But many recognized that with King's Landing fallen and their queen captured, further resistance was futile. In the Red Keep, the throne room was cleared of rubble, and the fires were doused. Jon stood near the base of the throne, meeting with Daenerys once more. They spoke in hushed tones, the tension still thick between them. "What now?" she asked softly, her gaze drifting to the Iron Throne. "You have it. Will you turn north to face the White Walkers and let me remain here with my people?" Jon exhaled a plume of breath in the cold, unheated hall. "I can't leave the city undefended. There are still Lannister loyalists who might try to retake it. But the threat from the north grows daily. I'll need to march an army back up the King's Road. And I'll need you and your dragons." She studied him, bitterness laced with longing. "I offered my dragons before, but you chose this path instead. Now you ask me again after you claim the throne for yourself. Why should I help you?" Jon closed his eyes for a moment. "Because the White Walkers spare no one. Because you want to save this realm. Because despite everything, we both care about the living." She was quiet, her resolve tested. The city around her was far from the slave cities of Essos where she had built her legend. Yet the call to save humanity from an otherworldly threat remained. "I will help you," she said at last, her voice subdued. "But I won't kneel." He accepted that with a nod. "I only ask for your help, not your submission." And so an uneasy alliance formed in the aftermath of conquest. Jon Snow, newly self-crowned king on the Iron Throne, began mustering the combined forces of the realm to march north. Daenerys retained control over her dragons and the Unsullied, though she begrudgingly fell under Jon's broader strategy. Raven after raven flew to the lords of the Westerlands, the Reach, Dorne, the Vale, the Riverlands, commanding them to join in the Great Northern Campaign. Those who resisted would be viewed as traitors to the crown. Inevitably, some refused, and more small battles flared. But with King's Landing secured and Cersei toppled, a surprising number obeyed. Ships were summoned to bring men around to White Harbor, forming a second front. The land route up the King's Road was long, but the bulk of the host would travel that way nonetheless, gaining momentum as they went. The entire realm stirred with a sense of anxious expectation, uncertain whether Jon's conquest heralded a new age of peace or more endless war. In the north, Sansa Stark oversaw the defenses of Winterfell, receiving word that the new king of the Seven Kingdoms, her own cousin, would soon return. She was stunned by the news that Jon had taken the throne and captured Cersei Lannister. She had never imagined he would fully abandon the original plan to plead for Southern support. But as the tidings explained his reasoning, that only by seizing the throne himself could he unify the realm, she felt a mix of pride, wariness, and sorrow. Would he truly keep his promise to return north before the wall fell? Winterfell had not heard much regarding the White Walkers in weeks, but there were reports that the dead stirred ominously near Eastwatch. Indeed, behind the scenes, ominous signs multiplied. Chilling winds from the shivering sea, sightings of whites near abandoned settlements, and the disappearance of several rangers from the Night's Watch. The war for the Dawn approached, unstoppable. The question was whether Jon's new dominion would rally in time, or whether the petty feuds and resentments of the great houses would still hamper the final battle. And so it was that Jon Snow, a man once content to serve in the Night's Watch, now wore the crown of the Iron Throne. He reigned in the scorched capital, not as a triumphant king but as a weary conqueror, knowing full well that the hardest fight lay ahead. He had bound the realm to his will, albeit tenuously. He had subdued King's Landing, albeit at great cost. He had even come to an uneasy agreement with Daenerys Targaryen, albeit with tension crackling beneath every exchange. In the weeks that followed, the city struggled to find stability. Jon's men restored order, punishing looters, feeding the hungry with supplies requisitioned from the Reach, and beginning repairs on the battered walls. Some common folk came to respect the new king who wore Stark furs, murmuring that he might actually care for their well-being. Others cursed him as just another tyrant on the Iron Throne. But the daily rhythms of life resumed, if only because the city had endured so many rulers in so few years that one more shift hardly mattered. Survival was the priority. Then, at last, a final raven arrived from the Night's Watch. The message was urgent. The wall had been breached at Eastwatch by the sea. The White Walkers were advancing on the north. The time had come. Jon summoned Daenerys, Davos, Tormund, and his other key allies to the throne room, each of them drawn and solemn. He read the raven's words aloud, his voice echoing in that cold hall. They march south. The dead are on the move. A hush fell, broken only by Tormund's softly muttered curse. Daenerys pressed her lips together, her gaze darkening. Davos's face went pale. Jon turned to them, the burden of 1,000 years of history weighing on his shoulders. Gather every man, every woman who can fight. Prepare the dragons, the armies, everything. We march within the fortnight. And so the muster began, a scramble to assemble supplies, to finalize alliances, to put the city's governance in some semblance of order before the entire realm's forces marched north. Daenerys flew her dragons over the mustering camps, a demonstration of power and a reminder of what they were fighting for. Jon rode out among the men, steel-eyed, bearing the sigil of House Stark on his cloak, but also the faint aura of Targaryen heritage that now clung to his name. Soldiers who had once bickered over loyalties found themselves side by side under the threat of the impending apocalypse. In the Red Keep, Cersei languished in her cell, awaiting trial. She hurled insults at her guards, at times screaming that she alone could have saved the city, that the new king was a traitor, that Daenerys was a foreign invader. Few bothered to respond. Jon was too consumed with the war preparations to decide her fate. He intended to have her stand trial eventually, but the prospect of the world ending made it seem a secondary concern. All the while, word of Jon's conquest rippled across the continent. The Vale Lords, who had once supported Littlefinger and then Sansa Stark, now debated whether to march. The Knights of the Vale, under Lord Royce, eventually heeded the call, forming ranks and beginning the journey. Dorne, fractured after the Sand Snake's demise, nonetheless sent a token force, led by a minor noble who claimed the Martell name. The Iron Islands were more complicated. Euron's fleet harried the coast, but Yara Greyjoy, having escaped her uncle, pledged some ships to Jon's cause, albeit reluctantly. It was a patchwork alliance, but it was more unity than Westeros had seen in years. Before long, the battered Tyrell bannermen of the Reach, the battered Tully bannermen of the Riverlands, the uncertain Stormlords who had lost Stannis, and the rebellious Lannister loyalists of the West all found themselves caught in the tide of history. Join the king in the north or be left vulnerable to the dead. The ultimatum was stark, and so the South, for the first time, began to move north en masse. Roads that had long only seen southern armies heading south were now filled with wagons and soldiers trudging into the heart of winter. It was a sight to behold. The entire Seven Kingdoms converging in the north to face a threat older than any crown. Jon departed King's Landing with his main host under the swirling banners of the Direwolf and the dragons of Daenerys in uneasy proximity. The forced camaraderie in the columns was remarkable. Knights who once fought Targaryen men at the Field of Fire centuries ago, their houses still telling tales of how they bent the knee to Aegon. Stormlanders who had once resisted northern expansions for generations. Riverlands knights who had lost sons during the War of the Five Kings. All marching together behind the stern leadership of a man who had once been nothing more than a northern bastard. He took one last look at the Iron Throne before leaving it behind in the Red Keep. He left a garrison of trusted northern soldiers to maintain order. The throne felt less significant now, overshadowed by the knowledge of what truly mattered. Power was a means to an end, to fight the darkness. That had been the reason for this brutal conquest from the start. If he failed to stop the dead, then the crown would be meaningless. As he set out, winter storms lashed the royal columns. Snow drifts lined the roads. Supplies diminished faster than expected, forcing them to rely on foraging and what was left in the southern storehouses. Daenerys sometimes flew overhead with her dragons to scout the land, though the beasts were uneasy in the relentless cold. They reached Moat Cailin, the ancient fortress at the threshold of the north, and Jon saw Sansa waiting among the battlements. She greeted him formally, calling him Your Grace, and he looked at her sadly, remembering days when they were both just children in Winterfell's halls. She escorted him through the fortress, where other northern lords awaited. They had learned of Jon's conquest, and while some bristled at the notion of him sitting on the Iron Throne, they respected his strength. Their real concern, however, was the White Walkers. Bran Stark, the strange and distant boy who had claimed the title of Three-Eyed Raven, had visions of an advancing army of the dead, thousands strong, led by the Night King astride the dread visage of an undead Viserion. Word spread that the wall had indeed fallen at Eastwatch. The undead dragon's blue flames had torn through centuries of ice. The Night's Watch survivors retreated to Castle Black, but it would not hold for long. Soon, the living's northern outposts would be overwhelmed. Jon called a final war council at Winterfell. The Great Hall was crowded beyond capacity with lords, knights, free folk, and Daenerys' advisors. Torches burned brightly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Jon stood at the head of the table, map spread before him. His eyes carried the weight of a man who had seen too many battles, too many betrayals, and had taken on the mantle of a conqueror for a realm that hardly deserved saving. Yet he pressed on. He told them of his plan to lure the White Walkers into open ground near the last river, using archers, pits, and dragonfire to thin their ranks before meeting them in a pitched battle. Daenerys and her dragons would concentrate on the White Walkers themselves, trying to take down the Night King if he showed himself. Meanwhile, a secondary force would defend Winterfell if the lines broke. Sansa's face was grim, "If this fails, we have no second chance," she said. "It will be the end of us all." Daenerys stood next to Jon, silent but supportive. Tyrion Lannister, who had joined them after witnessing Cersei's capture, contributed tactical insights. Davos Seaworth advised caution and planning for quick retreats if necessary. Tormund insisted that retreat was pointless, that you couldn't outrun the dead. Everyone, in their own way, prepared for a final stand. And so the armies of the living began their last march. A host so large that the King's Road was choked from Winterfell to Moat Cailin. Soldiers from every corner of Westeros trudged forward. The howling cold wind showed them no mercy. At night, they huddled in tents or sheltered in old keeps. By day, they scouted for the undead's approach. Every breath hung in the icy air. Days later, on a broad, snow-swept plain just north of Winterfell, the forces of life arrayed themselves. Thousands of northern spearmen, ranks of mounted knights from the Vale and the Reach, grim-faced warriors of the Free Folk, unsullied in perfect formation, and Dothraki riders who roamed the edges. Daenerys circled overhead with Drogon and Rhaegal, the beast's wings beating thunderously. King Jon Snow rode at the forefront, dressed in black armor etched with direwolf sigils, Longclaw at his side. Ghost padded near him, a silent sentinel. As the sun dipped behind a wall of cloud, a terrible hush fell. Far in the distance, a ragged black line appeared against the whiteness of the snow. A faint moaning rose, chilling the blood of even the bravest. The army of the dead stretched to the horizon, wights stumbling forward in a relentless tide, skeletal hands clutching swords and spears, eyes shining with cold malice. White walkers strode among them, tall and regal in their icy armor, frost-laced swords in hand. Above them flew the undead dragon, its once majestic form now twisted with necrotic energy. The Night King perched on its back. Jon felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This was it, the war he had dreaded and yet prepared for. He had fought so many battles against living foes to unify the realm, and now that unity would be tested to the limit. There would be no second chance. If they failed here, all of Westeros would fall beneath eternal winter. He glanced at Daenerys, who hovered overhead with her dragons. Their eyes met, a fragile trust shared. Then he raised Longclaw, the Valyrian steel shining faintly in the gloomy light. The horns sounded, a deep note echoing across the frozen plain. Men shouted, forming ranks, lifting shields. Flaming arrows were lit in preparation. Pits were uncovered, revealing trenches lined with dragon glass stakes. On the flanks, cavalry stirred. The living braced themselves, hearts pounding, steam rising in the cold air. The dead howled, surging forward in a tidal wave of rotting flesh and sharpened bone. Above, the undead dragon shrieked, unleashing a burst of blue flame that slashed across the sky. Daenerys answered with a roar from Drogon, flame dancing in the freezing wind. And so the final battle began. No words could fully capture the horror and intensity that followed. Lines of men clashed with an endless horde of wights. Arrows rained down, and scorpion bolts soared from makeshift siege weapons, some tipped with dragonglass. Daenerys swooped low, Drogon's fire scorching thousands of wights at once, while Rhaegal strafed the ranks of White Walkers, though their cold aura threatened to dim his flames. Cavalry charges crashed into the undead lines, only to be surrounded by clawing hands that pulled horses down in shrieking tangles. Jon led a vanguard of northern warriors, hacking a path through wights, seeking the White Walkers themselves. Davos and the men from the Stormlands fought valiantly alongside them. Tormund led the Free Folk in a fierce, savage assault, while the Unsullied held the center with unwavering discipline. For a moment, it seemed their well-orchestrated plan might hold. The D were being driven back by flames and dragonglass. But the Night King, astride the undead dragon, had yet to make his move. Then, with a shriek that pierced the soul, the undead dragon dived, breathing blue flame that cut a swath of destruction through Jon's lines. Men screamed as the unnatural fire devoured them. Jon narrowly escaped, throwing himself behind a fallen siege engine. He heard the roars of Drogon and Rhaegal as they engaged the undead dragon in a brutal aerial conflict. Ice and fire collided above, lighting up the sky in swirling embers and shards of frost. Jon scrambled to his feet, rallying the survivors around him. Arrows from the living soared skyward, some striking the undead dragon's hide. But it was no simple matter to bring down a beast of that size. Daenerys, flying on Drogon, tried to flank the Night King, but he evaded, launching icy spears conjured with some dark magic. One spear struck Rhaegal's wing, and the green dragon roared in pain. The lines of the living began to falter as more whites poured in from the flanks, unstoppable. In the chaos, White Walkers carved through knights, freezing steel and flesh alike. Everywhere terror reigned. Yet the living fought on with desperation and determination, for they knew there was no retreat from this field. Jon cut down white after white, Longclaw's Valyrian steel ensuring they stayed down. He locked eyes with a tall White Walker across the churned snow. The being lifted its icy blade in silent challenge. Jon advanced, swords clashing in a shower of frost and sparks. He felt the same cold dread he had known at Hardhome, but now he had a realm behind him, men who believed in him, a throne he had seized for this very purpose. He pressed the attack, forcing the White Walker back. With a sudden feint, he slipped past its guard and drove Longclaw into its heart. The icy figure shattered in an explosion of frost, collapsing into shards that melted in the snow. Around Jon, men saw the White Walker's demise, finding fresh courage. High above, Daenerys circled, searching for an opening to strike the Night King. He flew upon the undead dragon, weaving through the sky. With a sudden dive, the Night King aimed another spear of ice at Drogon. Daenerys pulled sharply, the spear missing by a hair's breadth, but the movement stalled her momentum. The undead dragon roared, turning to unleash another torrent of blue flame. Drogon answered with fire of his own, the two blasts colliding in a blinding display that lit the battlefield below. On the ground, the living reeled from the shockwave, men and whites alike thrown aside. Jon shielded his eyes, blinking away spots as the clash of powers overhead seared his vision. When he looked again, he saw Drogon spiraling, black scales scorched by the undead dragon's flame. The Night King steered his mount in for the kill, ice spear raised. A wild cry tore from Jon's throat. He rushed forward through the melee, ignoring the whites clawing at him, and pressed deeper into the field. All around him, the living's formations were breaking, but they fought with the desperation of cornered animals. He saw Tormund locked in battle with a cluster of whites, Davos backing him up. He saw Sansa and a small retinue of archers on a distant ridge, launching arrows into the fray. He couldn't see Daenerys, but he heard Drogon's anguished roar. And then, as if conjured by fate, Rhaegal, injured and bleeding, swooped in from a blind spot, ramming into the undead dragon with colossal force. The Night King was thrown from his saddle, plummeting toward the battlefield. With a thunderous crash, he landed in a snowdrift, scattering whites. The undead dragon and Rhaegal tangled overhead, locked in a savage struggle. Jon saw the Night King rise, unhurt by the fall, blue eyes scanning the battlefield. A ring of White Walkers formed around him, guardians for their king. Jon knew this was the moment. If the Night King died, the army of the dead might fall. He gathered every ounce of strength, carving his way through the whites. Northerners, unsullied, free folk. They all fought to clear a path for their king. He reached the ring of White Walkers, Longclaw gleaming with frost as it met their blades. He fought with unyielding determination, each parry risking a freezing slash. One by one, the White Walkers fell to Valyrian steel or to dragon glass-tipped spears from his allies. Finally, Jon stood before the Night King himself, the swirl of battle fading into an eerie hush. The Night King lifted his sword, a weapon of pure ice that pulsed with malevolent power. Jon raised Longclaw. No words would pass between them, for the Night King was silent, an embodiment of death itself. They clashed, ice meeting Valyrian steel. The force of it jarred Jon's arms to the bone. The Night King was impossibly strong, pushing Jon back step by step. Their blades locked. Jon felt the cold seeping in, numbing his limbs, summoning every memory, every sacrifice that had led him here. He forced back. In a last surge, Jon twisted free, then drove Longclaw in a downward slash that shattered the Night King's blade. The icy weapon fragmented, shards scattering. The Night King recoiled, and Jon saw the faintest flicker of something. Fear? Rage? Crossed the inhuman face. Then, seizing the moment, Jon plunged Longclaw into the Night King's chest. For an instant, the world seemed to hold its breath. A deep rumble reverberated across the battlefield. The Night King's form cracked like glass, a web of fractures spreading from the wound. Then he exploded in a burst of icy shards, a wave of frosty wind sweeping outward. Across the battlefield, Whites collapsed instantly, their eyes going dark. White Walkers similarly shattered. The undead dragon, locked in combat with Regal, gave a final shriek and plunged from the sky, crashing into the snow in a cloud of debris. It dissolved into a mass of melting ice, leaving behind only bones and blackened scales. A stunned silence fell. The living stood, panting, wounded, unsure if what they witnessed was real. Then a low cheer arose, growing into a thunderous roar of victory. Men embraced, dropping to their knees in relief. Daenerys circled above on Drogon, who was gravely injured but still alive, letting out a triumphant roar. Regal, too, though wounded, landed nearby with a pained groan. Jon fell to his knees, Longclaw slipping from his numb fingers. Tormund and Davos rushed to him, faces splitting with elation. Around them, the once endless sea of the dead lay still, reduced to lifeless corpses or piles of ice that glimmered in the first rays of morning light. The war was over. The realm, what remained of it, had survived. In the aftermath, the survivors tallied their losses. The field was littered with the fallen, men and women from every corner of Westeros. Fires were lit to burn the bodies before they could rise again. Though with the Night King destroyed, it seemed that threat had passed. The living wept for the lost, but they also held their heads high. They had stood together against annihilation. Jon, battered and exhausted, returned to Winterfell with the remnants of his host. The courtyard filled with cheers and tears. Sansa embraced him, relief etched in her features. Daenerys arrived on Drogon, greeted with cautious respect by those who had once feared her. For a moment, it seemed that old grudges could be set aside, that unity might endure. Over the coming weeks, the realm began to heal. The snows started to lessen with the defeat of the unnatural winter, as if the land itself sensed that the great threat was vanquished. Jon presided over a memorial service for the fallen, lighting pyres that spanned the fields around Winterfell, the smoke rising in a solemn testament to their sacrifice. Daenerys stood by his side, silent. Tormund, Davos, Tyrion, Sansa, Arya, those who had survived, reflected on how everything had changed in so short a time. Eventually, Jon knew he must return to King's Landing, to truly take up the mantle of kingship he had seized and then left unguarded. He would need to bring order to a realm devastated by war. Dorne, the Reach, the Westerlands, each had endured chaos. They would need rebuilding, a just hand to guide them, not another tyrant. Cersei would stand trial for her crimes, though some whispered she might never truly pay for all she had done. Before departing, he stood atop the battlements of Winterfell with Sansa. The chill wind played at their cloaks, though the sting of the cold felt lighter now. He looked out across the white-blanketed fields, remembering all that had passed here. The battles, the betrayals, the resurrections. "You've done what no one else could," Sansa said quietly. "You united the realm, ended the long night." Jon's eyes were distant. "At great cost. I wonder if the price was too high." He thought of the countless dead, the homes burned, the years of war. He thought of the ways he'd changed. Once the boy who knew nothing, now a king who had killed for a crown he never desired. "But it's done," he said. "Now we must build something better." She placed a hand on his arm. "You'll make a good king, Jon. Better than any I've known." He gave her a small, sad smile. Then he turned, descending the stairs to prepare for the journey south. The men called him King Jon Targaryen, the Wolf Dragon, King of the Seven Kingdoms. Yet in his heart, he would always be Jon Snow, the boy who grew up in Winterfell's shadow, who had seen beyond the wall and known the fierce love of a family he never thought he belonged to. He carried both the best hopes of House Stark and the fiery legacy of House Targaryen. Now, with the White Walkers banished to memory, his reign would begin in earnest. Whatever came next, whether a time of peace or the seeds of another conflict, one truth would stand forever. When the realm was threatened by an ancient and terrible foe, it was Jon Snow's abandonment of old allegiances, his conquest of the South, and his forging of a new unity that had saved them all. He had become, in the end, the reluctant conqueror who cast aside the threat he first fought to warn everyone about, only to lead the realm to face it in a final, decisive battle. And though his methods left deep scars, perhaps that was what was required to make the Seven Kingdoms truly stand as one against the darkness.